always thankful for somebody giving thanks in advance for what I may or may not say. That is a beautiful thing. So I certainly appreciate that. Good morning.
Good morning.
So you came here expecting a wedding, but there was a mistranslation. There was some false advertising. Nathan, are you with me?
I'm with you.
Yes. So you thought you were coming to a wedding, but there is no wedding today. That is not one of the gospel texts. The wedding at Cana is one of my favorite texts. I love the story, and I wish I was teaching it to you this morning. It's Jesus' first miracle in the Gospel of John, and it's a great, great story, but it is not our story for today. So it was false advertising. It's still the second chapter of John, but it was false advertising because we're still in John 2, but people come to me and they say, I want to.
Oh boy.
All right, David, I guess you got to preach now, man.
I got. Did it stop for everybody?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Oh, wait, I think he's back. Maybe not.
Well, that's what happened for him praising me last week during Sunday schools. I'm gonna stop. Should I stop sharing?
Just hold off. They're working on it. Technical.
Okay.
Trying to get back on.
I lost the.
I see them now. He's muted though. You're muted. There we go.
How about that?
I can
That's
hear
better.
you.
All right. So you're here. It was false advertising. It is not John 2 in the very beginning. It's John 2 a little later on. And it's strange that this passage is located at the beginning of John. People come to me and they say, I want a biblical wedding. So I hand them a Bible and they look through the Bible. The wedding ceremony we have is part of our tradition. It's not part of the biblical record. So you can go through and read the Bible and not find anything about for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until we are parted by death. That is from our tradition as a church, not from the biblical record. And I say, the only thing I can tell you about a biblical wedding is you have to have a lot of wine. That's what we know about a biblical wedding. That is the first miracle, John, the second chapter. You can read through that at home. That's what you thought. Some of you probably studied this, for hours before you got here. And I appreciate all the prep that you've done on John, the second chapter. And after the miracle, after that first miracle, there comes this line in John 2:12. After this miracle, Jesus went down to Capernaum, and with his mother and his brothers and disciples, and they remained there a few days. I'm still not exactly sure why that is so important, except perhaps later you get the sense that his brothers and his mother are not fully on board for where this journey is going to take them, especially his brothers. So you do get that later in the Gospel of John, but it's just kind of this strange separation. He's done a miracle, but maybe it's the transition from a private miracle. He does this first miracle with family and friends. This is kind of an internal miracle. They're gathered with the wedding party. And then he goes and visits with family. And after visiting with family, he heads to the Passover for the first time. And so today I'm kind of turning the tables on you. We're going to be discussing Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers and the sellers of cattle and sheep and doves. There are a few memes that have gone around about that one. If someone asks WWJD, remind them that turning over tables and breaking out a whip is a possibility. And this is a homemade whip. He doesn't bring one with him. He goes around and it's like he takes the things that are holding the animals, the cords that have held some of the animals, and he grabs some of those cords and he puts together a whip. That is not necessarily most people's picture of who Jesus is, gathering individual cords and putting together a whip. But there's a sense that this scene is prefiguring what happens at the end of the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, his public ministry here begins with this scene, and this public ministry happens at Passover in the temple. And how does the gospel end? Before the crucifixion, in the temple at Passover. So you get a sense of where we're having. And then the next one, I don't always, clear the temple, but when I do, I use a whip. So the question is, why does Jesus cleanse the temple? All four gospels tell this story. This is not a story just told in one gospel. All four gospels tell this story. And you may or may not be familiar with the term synoptic. Is that a word that you know? They call the three other gospels the synoptic gospels. And I've separated it out because it helps me to remember it's the same eye. Both Mark, Matthew, and Luke look at the story through the same eye. And John looks at it totally differently than anyone else. So if you think about it, Mark is the shortest gospel, and Mark is like the skeleton for what Luke and Matthew are writing. You get a sense that Mark has written just the facts as simple as possible. Here's the story. He uses the words and immediately over and over and over again. When you get to Matthew, Matthew begins to expand on that for a Jewish audience. You can go back, Nathan. I'm still on the all four gospels slide. I'm still working through that one. Sorry about that.
Too much coffee, I guess. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. And I get ahead of myself all the time. And then Luke is writing for a larger Gentile audience, okay? So you get Mark giving us just the facts, Matthew trying to convince a Jewish audience, and Luke speaking to a larger audience. And you'll get that sense in this story. In the synoptics, Jesus does this at the very end of his ministry, and it is the straw that breaks the camel's back. The religious authorities cannot have this. He has upset their whole system. They have a system where people will drive in. I mean, they walk in, they come in on beasts of burden. They make their way to the temple, and there was kind of a scheme that was going on. If you wanted to make a sacrifice, you would perhaps have raised your lamb at home, and you would bring your lamb to the temple. And when you brought your lamb to the temple, they would look at the lamb and they would find a blemish on the lamb, and they would upsell you. So they would be like, that lamb is just not good. You brought a shoddy lamb in here. That's not acceptable. And so we have these lambs right here. The one you brought with you from, Bethlehem is not acceptable. You need to buy this lamb, and they upsell you. And they did the same with the money changing. You could not buy a sacrifice with your coinage from home if you'd come from outside of Israel. If you were coming with other coins, they only accepted certain coinage for the temple tax. And so you had to go to the money changer. And it was not just like, here, going to get direct change. They also put together a surtax on that of 10 to 12%. So it was a way of making money, and a way, I feel like, of keeping people at a distance from God. You've got to go through us to get to God. And the only way that you can get to God is by paying more than you actually even have. And so they were exploiting people, and they were especially exploiting the poor. And in John, it's very different. Instead of it being the last thing that happens right before they decide, we got to get rid of this guy, it happens at the very beginning of his ministry. And really, that's the question that I'm struggling with in my preaching this week. And because it happens at the very first thing that happens in John, really, is right at the beginning. He does this. So let's look at it in the Gospel of Mark. There's some phrases that come up in the Gospel of Mark in the way Mark tells the story. They came to Jerusalem, And Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seat of those who sold doves. Doesn't say anything about cattle or sheep in this one, just the doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, is it not written, my house, not my Father's house, but my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. So he's trying to, shift the focus to say, this is not a place of transaction. This is a place of relationship. I think that's where I've come down on this, is that we sometimes turn our relationship with God into a transaction, an if-then statement. If I'll do this, then God, will you do this? As opposed to building up a relationship. And Mark is concerned about it being a house of prayer for all nations. So it's not just for the Jews, it is for everyone. And that's the way that Mark tells the story. Matthew tells the story. It's right after Palm Sunday. They come into town. It's this triumphal entry. And then Matthew's changes it just a little bit. My house should be called a house of prayer. But what's missing? For all the nations. Because who's Matthew trying to talk to? The Jews. He's trying to make this internal sort of argument and trying to convince them, my house shall be called a house of prayer. And he deletes for all nations in his story, or that's not part of his tradition, but you've made it into a den of robbers. And they both sort of use that language. You come in Palm Sunday, this triumphal entry. He enters as the king. And the events of Good Friday. But in John, it's the very first thing that happens. So we go to Isaiah 56:7. These I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifice will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. Nathan, if you move me to Isaiah, it's the next slide, 56:7. For my house shall be made a house of, did I lose them again? Okay, it's just not on my screen. So he's got it, but there's some lag in what I'm seeing there. It's fine. So he's them back to Isaiah. And if you want to do a little extra study this week, go back and read the beginning of Isaiah. Go back and read the beginning of Isaiah for how the prophet talks about, I take no delight in your solemn festivals, for all the things that you've done are no longer pleasing to me, God is saying through the prophet Isaiah. And then we hear the same story in Luke. Then Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling. No, it's just things. It's just things. It's not about the doves. It's not about the sheep. It's just those who were selling things. And perhaps for the larger Gentile audience, they might not have understood the symbolism of why you need a dove or why you need a unblemished lamb or whatever it might be. So he just says they were selling things. And then he says, my house should be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. And then it goes on in Luke. He says, every day Jesus was teaching in the temple, and the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. When you get to the Gospel of John, it doesn't say the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders. And really, this is a way of saying both the clergy and the laity were out to get Jesus. Okay, the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders. So the church council and the clergy were after Jesus. That's a way to say this. But when you get to the Gospel of John, the word that is used over and over again is the Jews. The Jews, the Jews, the Jews. And, you're good with, I'll get there in a second. But he says the Jews, and it really means the enemies of Jesus. Because if you think about it, they're all Jews, right? I mean, in the midst of this story, they're all Jews. So when it says the Jews, you could translate that better as the enemies of Jesus. So my next question is, why do we use doves? Do you remember where we've heard doves in this story at other points? We've seen doves before in Genesis 8. Remember, Noah sends out a dove, and what does the dove do? Brings back an olive branch, which I think is significant, Chris. It's something that I think we overlook. He sends out a dove, and it brings back an olive branch. And what is the olive branch a symbol of? Peace. So the dove is going out to grab an olive branch, which I think is interesting. And then we remember it from Jonah's name, meaning dove. And then what happens at Jesus' baptism? The dove comes down and the Holy Spirit goes into Jesus, doesn't just light on his shoulder, but goes into Jesus. And so we see that dove again. So the dove is an important symbol for Jesus himself. And it's also, alluded to in Prince's Purple Rain. I just throw that out there for a few of you. Another place we find dove is in Song of Solomon. And it's where the bride's beauty is extolled in Song of Solomon. And whenever a couple who wants to get married and have a so-called biblical wedding comes to me, I ask them what Bible verses they'd like to use. And they say, well, we're not sure. And we get to the rehearsal and they still haven't picked a text. So I give this to the reader. And I get the reader to stand at the lectern at the rehearsal and say, how beautiful you are, my love. How beautiful are your eyes, are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats moving down the slopes of Gilead. And pretty soon they come up with a scripture. But you can remember, it goes back to in Genesis 8, where he sent out the dove from him to see if the waters have subsided from the face of the ground. And the dove picked a freshly plucked olive leaf. And then he sends the dove out, and the dove does not return. And that finally gets us to our passage for today, John 2:13-22. And I'm sorry, Andy, that was lost in translation, because this is a text that kind of gets us toward Palm Sunday and Good Friday. And this is where we are in the church here. This is the week before Palm Sunday. And so we read this story. And how long was Jesus' ministry, friends?
3 years.
How do we? 3 years, 4 years, 3 years, says Johnny Stone. Johnny, how do we know it was 3 years?
Oh boy, that's a tough question for me.
Because the Bible tells me so, says Fran. The book of John is the only way that we have a sense that it's 3 years. Each of the other gospels could have happened in a year, but in the Gospel of John, you get the Passover in chapter 2, you get the Passover in chapter 6 and chapter 11, and then at the end of the book. So you get enough Passovers to show that his ministry was at least 3 years. It's only in the Gospel of John, and that's where we've gone back. So knowing that the Passover has come is an important marker in Jesus' life. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And it is up. If you've never been to Jerusalem, it is up. Jesus probably would have come down the Galilean Valley to a low place like Jericho and walked up that steep road into Jerusalem. And in the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves. It used to be done out in the Kidron Valley. It used to be done out at the base of the Mount of Olives. You would take this long journey, this pilgrimage into Jerusalem, and out on the edge of the city, you could buy something to sacrifice. You wanted to atone for your sin, you wanted to make an offering, you wanted to make a sacrifice. And this was something that was set up as a convenience for people who were traveling. And that was a gift, you know what I'm saying? And it was out in the valley. And then somehow, they think it might have been Caiaphas, invited them not just into the outer courtyard, but into the inner courtyard of the temple. And this may be one of the reasons that Jesus is so upset that things have been moved inside that were earlier done outside. And the money changers were seated at their table inside the inner court of the temple. And he makes a whip of cords. He drove all of them out of the temple. And someone said this is his second miracle. Because you can imagine there may have been 20, 30, 50,000 people gathered there, and one crazy guy with a whip of cords driving everyone out of the temple. And he said, that's a miracle that everyone responded to one guy, as opposed to, the bouncers putting him down and stopping him. He was able to drive everyone out of the temple. And it's an awesome show of power. He drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. And he also poured out the coins of the money changer and overturned their tables. Has Jesus ever overturned your tables? And he told those who were selling doves. I was talking about this with my family. I said, it's interesting. He starts out and he drives out the people selling sheep and cattle, but he doesn't say, let the doves go. He's like, take those doves out of here. I don't want you to let these birds loose in here. He says, take the birds out. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. And then this is interesting. It's kind of a shift, that his disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. And it's not that they remember that at that moment. It's they remember that later on when they begin to see all these things fitting together. Where you see, the Jews said this to him, what sign can you show us for doing this? And that happens over and over in John. People are looking for a sign, and Jesus gives them a sign. But at this point, Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it up. You ever have a conversation when you feel like you're just not communicating? When you're just talking past the other person? That is like the Gospel of John. Jesus says something and the people are confused by what he says. And it's not always as straightforward. You have to think through this. Jesus says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And if you're sitting there in the temple, what are you thinking? You're thinking about the building. A building they've been working on for 46 years. Anybody ever have to serve as a trustee? Okay, so you get the feeling, because the Jews, the enemies of Jesus, then said, this temple has been under construction for 46 years and you'll raise it up in 3 days. But Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. Over and over again in the Gospel of John, they seem to be talking past each other. And I want to just emphasize this, that the Jews in John, whenever you read that phrase, I just always want to cross it out and say the enemies of Jesus. Because these phrases, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, have been used over the years to promote anti-Semitism. Anybody have Jewish neighbors? Okay. And they read passages like this, and they can feel the offense, because it's like, who put Jesus to death? Well, it was the Jew. Well, if you read carefully, it's not just the Jews, they're Roman officials. I mean, this is not just the Jews who are doing this, but it's the enemies of Jesus. Any of those who stood in opposition to Jesus are referred to the Jews, because in the synoptics, they're called the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, but there are more people involved in Jesus' death. And some would say we all bear responsibility. We all bear responsibility, because Jesus is sent to them and they responded in a way that led to his death. The Jews then said to him, what sign can you show us for doing this? And then Jesus almost responds with a challenge. He's like, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And they have no idea what he's talking about. It's been crazy enough that he's come with a whip and kicked everybody out of the outer court of the temple. It's crazy enough that he's been able to do this. And then they have this strange conversation. Some would argue that the temple was already being destroyed, and it was being destroyed from the inside out. That Jesus is not saying that he's going to destroy the temple. He's saying to them, you're already destroying the temple by the way that you're using this space. You let it become a marketplace. You let it become a place of transaction and not a place of relationship. And Jeremiah said it earlier in Jeremiah 7, your disobedience and corruption led to the destruction of the temple. So they're looking for the Messiah. And what are some of the signs of the Messiah? If you ask a faithful Jew at that time, what would be the signs of the Messiah? They would expect the Messiah to bring world peace. And then we get to the dove and the olive branches. I would like to argue against Palm Sunday. In only one of the Gospels does it say that he grabbed palm branches. In the others, it says they grabbed branches from the trees. And where are they when they grab branches from the tree? Coming down from the Mount of. So what does it feel like when they grab olive branches and they're waving olive branches as Jesus comes into the city? You feel the symbolism change there? That perhaps I would like us to celebrate Olive Branch Sunday. Instead of just Palm Sunday, Olive Branch Sunday. The other sign of the Messiah is the Messiah would resurrect the dead. And that is the straw that breaks the camel's back in John. When you get to the raising of Lazarus is when they decide that he's got to die, that they cannot no longer abide having Jesus on the scene, is when when he resurrects the dead. And they also said that he would restore the temple. And that's the confusing part here. He's talking about his body. They're talking about the physical space. Other signs of the Messiah, according to Judaism at that time, that he would rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. You remember that the temple was destroyed a second time in 70 AD. And this is about the time the Gospel of John is written down. That he would bring about the end of war so that everyone could live in peace. He would unite all people regardless of differences like religion and culture. He would bring a true awareness of God to all people and also signal the end of the world. And we think about that as the second coming of the Messiah, not the first coming of the Messiah. And many are waiting for the second their first coming, our second coming, and seeing that as the signal of the end of the world. Then we move to the last verse. After Jesus was raised from the dead, John 2:22. After Jesus was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, believe the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken to him. And that really is what John is all about. John is written so that you might believe, so that you might be changed. And so there's foreshadowing all throughout the Gospel of John of what will happen later on. And so I'm left to ponder the question, why does Jesus clear the temple in John so early? It's foreshadowing, yes. Is it a show of strength? Is it a way to set the tone with everyone that he is there and he's willing to say, we must protect this house? Anybody remember that? We must protect this house. We must protect the house of the Lord. And it reminds me of Psalm 69, this prayer for deliverance from persecution. Jesus tended to quote the Psalms. Jesus is there on the cross and says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why are you so far from my groaning? I cry to you day and night, but you do not answer. Anybody know what Psalm that is? 22. Psalm 22. And so Jesus quotes the Psalms, and he does it here again. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I've come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I'm weary with my crying. My throat is parched. My eyes grew dim with waiting for God. More in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Can you hear the echoes of what Jesus is going through here in the Gospel of John? Many of those who would destroy me, my enemies who accuse me falsely. What did I must I now restore? Oh God, you know my folly. The wrongs I've done are not hidden from you. Do not let those who hope in you be put to shame because of me. O God, Lord, the God of hosts, do not let those who seek you be dishonored because of me. O God of Israel, it is for your sake that I have borne reproach, that shame has covered my face. I become a stranger to my kindred, an alien to my mother's children. And maybe that's why there's this reference there to him going to see his brothers and the struggle, that there's this echo of Psalm 69. And then in verse 9, this is what he says there. It is zeal for your house that has consumed me. It is zeal for your house that has consumed me. And so they're quoting from the Psalms once again. And the better that we know the Psalms, the more that we can hear some of these things. I'm the subject of gossip for those who sit in the gate, and the drunkards make songs about me. When I am humbled, my soul with fasting, they insulted me for doing so. So many of these things in the life of Jesus and John. And so I skipped down, Nathan, to why at the beginning of John. It's 69 is a lament of someone whose passion for God resulted in separation from both family and community. Sometimes our passion from God will separate us from those who we are in relationship with. It takes us a different direction. There's a life that's lived faithfully, but finds shame and dishonor and insult. That's really what happens in Psalm 69. He seeks to live a faithful life, but it ends up bringing a sense of shame and dishonor and insight. It's all alluded to at the end of John. At the end of John, so a life rooted in zeal for his Father's house led to his alienation and death. It's really what Psalm 69 is about. So I know I've wandered a little bit here at the end. It's just a strange text to come so early in the Gospel of John. So these are questions I'd like you to think and ponder as I think and ponder these questions. What are you most zealous about? If we were to look at your life, what would someone else say you're most zealous about and most passionate about in your life? For Jesus, it was his zeal for his Father's house. It was, and I'm not sure it's zeal for the building of the temple. I think it's zeal for the house of God, the body of believers. When and where has your faith made things difficult, if it ever has? When is anger righteous and when it is not? That's often the way this passage is taught, is Jesus is righteously angry, and because Jesus got angry, it's okay for me to get angry. You ever use that? We tend to say, and if this passage had not been there, we wouldn't be able to rely on that quite so much. And often this is reduced to, there's a time to get angry, there's a time not to get angry, and it should be okay that I got angry because Jesus got angry. And then finally, where might you need to offer an olive branch as we move toward Palm Sunday, as we move toward Palm Sunday? Some things to reflect on. I hope you got a different, just heard that text a little differently this time as we try to compare it to what we see in the other three Gospels called the Synoptics, the same-eye Gospels. And John just looks at things totally differently. So I invite you to discuss these questions among yourselves and see where that takes you. Thanks for listening.